And I said, okay, well, let's make it even easier. Let's say we found a culture that was literally removing the eyeballs of every third child, okay, at birth. Would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said it would depend on why they were doing it.
No. What?
So after my eyebrows returned from the back of my head, I said, okay, well, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness or some such nonsense.
What kind of nonsense is that? The God Debate 2. Harris versus Craig. That is Sam Harris versus William Lane Craig. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be reviewing another debate, this time with a well-known one of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement, Sam Harris. He carries himself in such a calm demeanor and is soberingly critical. So he has a background in neuroscience. I believe it's neuroscience. He has a PhD in that. He studied science, philosophy, you name it. William Lane Craig is a philosopher. And if there's one piece of wisdom I enjoy before we watch this together, Daniel Dennett, who's now passed, studied philosophy almost his entire life. And he kind of tells his testimony like this. When he discovered neuroscience and how physically things operate in the mind and the brain and things like that, he realized, in a nutshell, and I might be butchering this a little bit, but he realized and recognized how much baloney philosophy operates. Like, most of philosophy is just baloney in a sense. And, you know, you can merge it, but with science. You need it guided by factual data, empirical data, and not just out here making up stuff. And he noticed that. We'll have to react to that at some point too. This is before he passed away. I watched a video where he described that, and that guy was sharp. I've read some of his books. So let's see what happens here. I've never watched this debate at all. In fact, Sam Harris was not even on my radar. A lot of you were like, what's up with all these books behind you? And you don't have, you know, Christopher Hitchens, and you don't have Sam Harris. You don't have... No, most of them are like ancient historical books, primary sources, Roman and Greek history, Bible, Old and New Testament, ancient Near Eastern material, Mesopotamian material, you name it, the history of Rome, other stuff that's theological and whatnot. But look, you recommended this. I sincerely appreciate you on being part of our community. Like this thing, subscribe, check the bell. Let's get this party started. Sorry for the long-winded intro.
I want to begin by thanking the Center for Philosophy of Religion for the invitation to participate in tonight's debate. The question of the correct foundation of morality is one that is not only of tremendous academic interest, but also one that has enormous practical application for our lives. Now, to begin with an important point of agreement, Dr. Harris and I agree that there are objective moral values and duties. To say that moral values and duties are objective is to say that they are valid and binding, independent of human opinion. For example, to say that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil, even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil, even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them so that everybody thought the Holocaust was good. One of the great merits of Dr. Harris's recent book, The Moral Landscape, is his bold affirmation of the objectivity of moral values and duties. He inveighs against what he calls the overeducated, atheistic, moral nihilists and relativists who refuse to condemn as objectively wrong terrible atrocities like the genital mutilation of little girls. He rightly declares, if only one person in the world held down a terrified, struggling, screaming little girl, cut off her genitals with a septic blade and sewed her back up, the only question would be how severely that person should be punished. What is not in question is that such a person has done something horribly, objectively wrong. The question before us this evening, then, is what is the best foundation for the existence of objective moral values and duties? What grounds them? What makes certain actions objectively good or evil, right or wrong? In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, if God exists, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. And second, if God does not exist, then we do not have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Now notice that these are conditional claims. I shall not be arguing tonight that God exists. Maybe Dr. Harris is right, that atheism is true. That wouldn't affect the truth of my two contentions. All that would follow is that objective moral values and duties would then, contrary to Dr. Harris, not exist.
It's amazing to me just hearing him express. It's like, imagine we're in like reverse what Craig does. Well, granted, he could be right. God doesn't exist. There's no moral values. Look around you, right? What if there is moral values and there's no God? I mean, just suppose that Sam Harris is correct. There's a way to somehow ground these things empirically based on human experience and all sorts of measures that would help us see things are closer to an idealized good or a bad. And, I haven't even read his book. I need to read his book on ethics and understanding how he thinks through this. But, like, Craig sets these things up where, you don't have absolute moral values unless you have a God. And it's like, maybe a lot of atheists will agree against Sam. I don't know. I haven't studied this in depth, but I just think it's kind of interesting how he takes these approaches to win debates no matter what. And it's fun for show, but not always the best for learning in terms of actually educating.
So let's look at that first contention together. If God exists, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Here, I want to examine two subpoints with you. First, theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral values. Moral values have to do with what is good or evil. On the theistic view, objective moral values are grounded in God. As St. Anselm saw, God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. And
it's kind of interesting, isn't there also, is it the Euthyphro dilemma, where is it really grounded in God, or is good just good, and like it's because it's grounded in God, or God can go beyond these things, or I can't remember the exact dilemma with Euthyphro, but my point is like he immediately is going with this idea that God is the reason there's good or bad. And I think about all of the societies in history that I've read and studied and thought they all had different polytheistic systems, different kinds of ways in which their ethics were anchored. And of course, if you just follow his conclusion to the Bible and find the atrocities there, the slavery there, and also the fossils of what once appeared to be human sacrifice, like actual infant human sacrifice in the Bible that seems to be a remnant of ancient Israelite worship, this is the same God. Now, he could just say, well, later, the revelation was shown later and the truth that God revealed. It's such nonsense.
Therefore, the highest good. Indeed, he is not merely perfectly good, he is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature provides the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is, by nature, loving, generous, faithful, kind, and so forth. Thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist, wholly independent of human beings.
It sounds so horseshit to me. The way I'm sorry, I have to butt in here. Just thinking about what he's saying, everything, all these attributes he's attributing to God, which I know the Bible does this. These are humans who are putting this perception onto God. They're the ones that are projecting this based on things they see in other humans and an idealized, good, something that is better and likely platonic in many cases, especially by the Hellenistic period forward, but it just sounds like horseshit.
Second, theism provides a sound foundation for objective moral duties. On a theistic view, objective moral duties are constituted by God's commands. God's moral nature is expressed in relation to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties or obligations. Far from being arbitrary, God's commandments must be consistent with his holy and loving nature.
Well, they're not. And you could read a lot of passages where some of the crap that's performed is ridiculous. And there would be no reason, justifiable reason, to have some of these commands or to do things this way, especially if you're the God of the universe who can do the kind of miracle magic that you see described in much of this text. I just find it silly, and it also makes me think of like that at some point they needed this top-down daddy told me so in order to keep people in line. It worked. It was natural. We evolved to construct these kind of myths, and people believed these constructions of laws that were given by gods. Though humans clearly fabricated them, maybe based on an observation and believed they were divine to some extent. Maybe some of it was purposeful invention, and they thought that God was working through them. I don't know. But either way, they're human.
Our duties, then, are constituted by God's commandments, and these, in turn, reflect his essential character. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the whole moral duty of man can be summed up in the two great commandments. First, you shall love the Lord your God with all your strength and with all your soul and with all your heart and with all your mind. And second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On this foundation, we can affirm the objective rightness of love, generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality, and condemn as objectively wrong selfishness, hatred, abuse, discrimination, and oppression.
I would be curious, just to reverse this on Craig here, what makes it wrong? God said, or it was just wrong apart from God? I just ask because, if you start pressing if there's no God, right, then what? Craig starts to create a world where there's no ethics, no actual morality at all? I mean, what is Craig's view? Does he honestly think there is no existing morality if God doesn't exist? It's either all or nothing in his view? And that's kind of a scary place to be. It's almost like when David Wood once said in a debate, I think it was against Matt Dillahunty, when he said something like, if Jesus isn't really the Messiah and Christianity isn't true, I might as well go murder. Like, what?
In summary, then, theism has the resources for a sound foundation for morality. It grounds both objective moral values and objective moral duties. And hence, I think it's evident that if God exists, we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Let's turn then to my second contention, that if God does not exist, then we do not have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Consider first the question of objective moral values. If God does not exist, then what basis remains for the existence of objective moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have objective moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time.
Just so we're on the same page, Craig believes we evolved as well. He believes evolution. He thinks the Earth is 13 point whatever, I can't remember what, not 13 point, but 4 point whatever, 3 point whatever billion years old. I mean, like, he's in line with the scientific view, and yet he's got to have God somehow a couple thousand years back decide he's going to introduce himself and start working with humanity. It's pretty insane, his view. I would like to get the quotes, but I believe he does think evolution's true. What does he think? It's just not random. He thinks that what we saw happen in the fossil record is all like intentional, God guiding kind of evolution. What the hell?
on atheism, it's hard to see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good any more than insect well-being or rat well-being or hyena well-being. This is what Dr. Harris calls the value problem. The purpose of Dr. Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, is to explain the basis on atheism of the existence of objective moral values. He explicitly rejects the view that moral values are Platonic objects existing independent of the world. So,
Yeah, it sounds like that's what Craig would hold to, because Christianity derives out of Platonism.
his only recourse is to try to ground moral values in the natural world.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to apologize here. I have to stop. You don't have that otherworldly thing to know. It's kind of wild. If you want to just put it in a piggy bank in your brain, like a cloud, and say morality's up here, you have no way of grabbing it. You have no way to know it's up there. You have a book, of course. He wants to get into divine revelation, but yeah, you should try to anchor it based on what we see here and down here and not up there. Once it's up there, it's untouchable. And therefore, it can't be changed by many of these people's views.
But how can you do that? Since nature in and of itself is just morally neutral. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the behavioral byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have evolved a sort of herd morality for precisely the same reasons. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But
let's not forget our brain size and the developments we've made from our cousins, chimpanzees. But yeah, this is why you can also probably point out, and he probably is going to get there, on the atrocities committed by chimpanzees or the crazy stuff happening. And you got to look at humans and say, we're doing that too. So yeah, we're all part of the same species that has evolved to behave certain ways.
On the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively binding and true. The philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality is objectively true is to succumb to the temptation to speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias in favor of one's own species.
Okay, so this is an interesting thing that Craig's bringing up here. Why do humans, act like we have actual morality, but we can watch, let's say, the bees kill and murder their own, right? But not bat an eye. That's how they function, how they operate in nature. You also look at chimpanzees. Again, we could look at them. How do they function in nature? I can imagine Sam Harris, and we'll probably get there. I could predict he would get down into the weeds of each and every one of these examples, looking at them very closely, scientifically, and then try to observe and see what we see, what we can measure, what we can see pattern-wise, and draw out from that and the facts of what we see to learn what seems to be the closest to what we would call morality or an ethical system within that particular species. So does that make that bees do this wrong or right? If God exists, wouldn't you think Craig would maybe accept that the animal kingdom has a lot of morals messed up? I mean, they have private parts like we do. They give birth like we do. We came out from them. He believes we evolved from them. Like, it's a weird thing. He likes to put the humans above, and it's like, what do you do with the animal kingdom then, if that's the case?
If there is no God, then any reason for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens on this planet as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur.
Okay. I see what he's saying there, particularly as an attack towards Sam. It'll be interesting to see how Sam will address this idea, if he does. But I get what Craig's saying here. At the end of the day, like, what makes this so grounded? And is this a language game? Is this a mental game? Is this whole thing about you need it to be in this thing out there in order for it to even mean anything? It's almost like a lot of Christians who say, if there's no heaven after this means nothing. If we don't go somewhere when we die, then this doesn't matter. It's kind of crazy. That mentality is like, well, what about that right now? What about the thing right now, that we're experiencing?
Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says there is at bottom no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference? We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. So how does Sam Harris propose to solve the value problem? The trick he proposes is simply to redefine what he means by good and evil in non-moral terms. He says, we should define good as that which supports the well-being of conscious creatures. So, he says, questions about values are really questions about the well-being of conscious creatures.
Why wouldn't that be? Who's redefining what? Maybe back then good was anchored with God because theism reigned the day and everybody was a believer in God. But to try to get more precise with language and science coupled in with philosophy and whatnot, why wouldn't you want to redefine terms and come up with a system that makes the best sense on our experiences and whatnot? It'll be interesting to see if they engage down the road here.
And therefore, he concludes, it makes no sense to ask whether maximizing well-being is good. Why not? Because he's redefined the word good to mean the well-being of conscious creatures. So, to ask, why is maximizing creatures' well-being good? Is on his definition the same as asking, why does maximizing creatures' well-being maximize creatures' well-being? It's just a tautology. It's just talking in circles. So
it's kind of weird. To me, I imagine Craig has this idea of good anchored in the gospel narrative. What is good? Good master. What shall I do to attain? Why do you call me good? Like this old philosophical understanding of what good might be. But it'll be interesting to see how Sam addresses this. Again, very, very interesting.
Dr. Harris has, quote unquote, solved the value problem just by redefining his terms. It's nothing but wordplay. At the end of the day, Dr. Harris isn't really talking about moral values at all. He's just talking about what's conducive to the flourishing of sentient life on this planet. Seen in this light, His claim that science can tell us a great deal about what contributes to human flourishing is hardly controversial. Of course it can, just as it can tell us what is conducive to the flourishing of corn or mosquitoes or bacteria. His so-called moral landscape, which features the highs and lows of human flourishing, isn't really a moral landscape at all. Thus, Dr. Harris has failed to solve the value problem. He hasn't provided any justification or explanation for why, on atheism, moral values would objectively exist at all. His so-called solution is just a semantical trick of an arbitrary and idiosyncratic redefinition of the terms good and evil in non-moral vocabulary. Second question, does atheism provide a sound foundation for objective moral duties? Duty has to do with moral obligation or prohibition, what I ought or ought not to do. Here, the reviewers of the moral landscape have been merciless in pounding Dr. Harris's attempt to provide a naturalistic account of moral obligation. Two problems stand out. First, natural science tells us only what is, not what ought to be, the case. As philosopher Jerry Fodor has written, science is about facts, not norms. It might tell us how we are, but it wouldn't tell us what is wrong with how we are.
I'd be curious to just, I'm thinking, maybe correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but like intuitively you would think by observing suffering from other humans, other people, different groups, including your own group, so tribalism, you recognize something and there's a pattern there that this isn't good. We don't like that, is meaning that that's not good. This is not the best for our society, the best for our people, the best for our health, the best for our children's upbringing. You start recognizing these things and these categories start to form into structural things we'd call morality, ethics, laws, and whatnot. That seems kind of natural to me and normal. I don't know why Craig would need some God to tell you what you ought to do when a lot of these things are intuitive in nature. As you see, the animal species, he brought up the chimpanzees, where one might even lay down their life to help save their children or someone in their tribe in the animal species, including humans. So they feel an ought to try and do that by surviving. These are just built into us in nature, and some people don't have that built into them. So we codify it to try and make that be the ideal thing that humans try to aim toward. I don't know. It's just odd to me how he's making this all sound.
In particular, it cannot tell us that we have a moral obligation to take actions which are conducive to human flourishing. So,
no, it doesn't need to. You need God, Daddy in the sky to tell you? What about all the Hittite law codes and the Hammurabi and all the divinities of all the other nations who their gods were telling their people? Are you needing that old-fashioned model that a God, a daddy, a mommy has to tell you what to do and how you should do it in order to do it? Why can't we grow up and realize that stuff?
If there is no God, what foundation remains for objective moral duties? On the naturalistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female, it forcibly copulates with her, but it doesn't rape her. For none of these actions is forbidden or obligatory. There is no moral dimension to these actions. So if God does not exist, why think we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these obligations upon us? Where did they come from? It's very hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression ingrained into us by societal and parental conditioning.
I do agree with that. It seems to me that, he's right. The subjective impression that we would gain. Be curious to see how Sam will tackle this, but it's like Craig doesn't realize that, like, when people don't believe in God, right, and they're not convinced and they think he's, delusional on his belief in God, what he's doing is really laying out the groundwork for subjective morality here. I'm pointing out, if God doesn't exist, well, guess what? Then we need to all be more on the subjective route. And it's like, well, at least it seems Sam's attempting to try and ground something, even if at the bottom of it, it might be subjective, but it's based on our experiences the best we can objectively to ascertain these ethics. I don't think Craig even cares to see that. He wants everyone to be a Christian anyway.
On the atheistic view, certain actions such as rape and incest may not be biologically and socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development have become taboo, that is, socially unacceptable behavior.
I agree. I mean, that seems to make sense to me.
But that does absolutely nothing to prove that such acts are really wrong. Such behavior goes on all the time.
Is it Craig's impression, and it seems to be, that before humanity even existed, actions like that were already destined for all eternity to be wrong? And if that's the case, then all the billions of years leading up to where we are now, from the creation of the universe, then these have always been wrongs. And then humans ended up getting here, and all of the stuff that happened to get here where we are now, we've just started to learn and stop doing those things. But he waited, I don't know how many billions of years. The universe has been around, and billions of years since life started to evolve on this planet, in order to give us those codes, in order to tell us, you should not do these things, and you should do these things. You ought to do these, and you ought not to do these. What the
animal kingdom. On the atheistic view, the rapist who chooses to flout the herd morality is doing nothing more serious than acting unfashionably, the moral equivalent, if you will, of Lady Gaga. If there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law. And if there is no objective moral law, then we have no objective moral duties. Thus, Dr. Harris's view lacks any source for objective moral duty. Second problem, ought implies can. A person is not morally responsible for an action which he is unable to avoid. For example, if somebody shoves you into another person, you're not responsible for bumping into him. You had no choice. But Sam Harris believes that all of our actions are causally determined and that there is no free will. Dr. Harris rejects not only libertarian accounts of free will, but also compatibilistic accounts of freedom. But if there is no free will, then no one is morally responsible for anything. In the end, Dr. Harris admits this, though it's tucked away in the endnotes of his volume. Moral responsibility, he says, and I quote, is a social construct, not an objective reality. I quote, in neuroscientific terms, no person is more or less responsible than any other for the actions they perform. His thoroughgoing determinism spells the end of any hope or possibility of objective moral duties because on his worldview, we have no control over what we do. Thus, on Dr. Harris's view, there is no source of objective moral duties because there is no moral lawgiver, and no possibility of objective moral duty because there is no free will. Therefore, on his view, despite his protestations to the contrary, right and wrong do not really exist.
Do not really exist. It's really, really weird. It's almost like if God is life, pretend in this view, God is life. He's life. And we claim we have life. But then someone comes around and says, there's no God. And they go, well, that means there's no real life. No. You think it's life, but these are just atoms floating through the universe. These are just molecular components of our cosmos that are just bouncing around, and, inanimate, materials caused animate materials to arise, but that's not life. There's no life if there's no life giver. there's no life. And it's like, what the hell happened if that's not a redefinition of terms? Like, I think he just has it backwards, it feels like.
Thus, Dr. Harris's naturalistic view fails to provide a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Hence, if God does not exist, we do not have a sound foundation for morality, which is my second contention. In conclusion, then, we've seen that if God exists, we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and objective moral duties. But that if God does not exist, then we do not have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Dr. Harris's atheism thus sits very ill with his ethical theory. What I'm offering Dr. Harris tonight is not a new set of moral values. I think by and large we share the same applied ethics. Rather, what I'm offering is a sound foundation for the objective moral values and duties that we both hold dear. Thank you very much.
All right, here we go. Let's see what happens here.
Dr. Harris now has 20 minutes. Timekeeper, are you ready? Begin.
Well, first let me say it's an honor to be here at Notre Dame, and I'm very happy to be debating Dr. Craig, the one Christian apologist who seems to have put the fear of God into many of my fellow atheists. I've actually gotten more than a few emails this week that more or less read, "Brother, please don't blow this." So you will be the judge. Now, as many of you know, I've spent a fair amount of time criticizing religion. And one of the perks of this job is that you immediately hear from all the people who think that criticizing religion is a terrible thing to do. And strangely, the reason people rise to the defense of God is not that there's so much evidence that God exists, but that they believe that belief in God is the only intellectual framework for an objective morality. And clearly Dr. Craig is among their number. Now, the sense is that without the conviction that moral truths exist, that words like right and wrong and good and evil actually mean something, humanity will just lose its way. That's the fear. And I actually share that fear. I've come to believe that this concern that many religious people have of the erosion of secular morality is not an entirely empty one. Now, I once spoke at an academic meeting on these themes, and I said, as I will say tonight, that once we understand morality in terms of human well-being, we'll be able to make strong claims about which behaviors and ways of life are good for us and which aren't. And I cited as an example the sadism and misogyny of the Taliban as an example of a worldview that was less than perfectly conducive to human flourishing. And it turns out that to denigrate the Taliban at a scientific meeting is to court controversy. Mm-hmm. And after my remarks, I fell into debate with another invited speaker. And this is more or less exactly how our conversation went. She said, "How could you ever say that forcing women to wear burqas is wrong from the point of view of science?" I said, well, because I think it's pretty clear that right and wrong relate to human well-being, and it's just as clear that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a way of maximizing human well-being. And she said, well, that's just your opinion. And I said, okay, well, let's make it even easier. Let's say we found a culture that was literally removing the eyeballs of every third child, okay, at birth. Would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said it would depend on why they were doing it.
No. What? I mean, come on now. That's pretty extreme. Are you kidding me? I like he's going with an extreme example.
So after my eyebrows returned from the back of my head, I said, okay, well, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness or some such nonsense.
What kind of nonsense is that?
Yeah.
Can't get over it. Every third shall walk in darkness. I could see some dumb shit like that happening.
And then she said, well, then you could never say that they were wrong. Okay, and so you should know, I was talking to someone who has a deep background in science and philosophy. She's actually since been appointed to the President's Council on Bioethics. She's one of 13 people advising President Obama on all of the ethical implications of advances in medicine and related science and technology. And she had just delivered a perfectly lucid lecture on the moral implications of neuroscience for the courts. And she was especially concerned that we could be subjecting captured terrorists to lie detection neuroimaging technology. And she viewed this as really an unconscionable violation of cognitive liberty. So on the one hand, her moral scruples were very finely calibrated to recoil from the slightest perceived misstep in ethical terms in our war on terror. And yet she was quite willing to forgive some primitive culture its fondness for removing the eyeballs of children in its religious rituals. And she seemed to me quite terrifyingly detached from the very real suffering of millions of women in Afghanistan at this moment. So I see this double standard as a problem. And strangely, this is precisely the erosion of basic common sense that many religious people are worried about. I hope it'll be clear to you at the end of this hour that religion is not an answer to this problem. Okay, belief in God is not only unnecessary for a universal morality, it is itself a source of moral blindness.
Wow.
Now, it's widely believed that there are
Wow. That's heavy. I can't wait to see how he unpacks that.
two quantities in this universe. There are facts on the one hand, and of course science can give us our most rigorous discussion of these. But then there are values, which many people like Dr. Craig think science can't touch. Okay, questions of meaning and morality and what life is good for. Now, of course, everyone thinks that science can help us get what we value, okay, but it can never tell us what we ought to value. Okay, and therefore it cannot, in principle, be applied to the most important questions in human life, questions like how we should raise our children or what constitutes a good life. Now, it's thought from the point of view of science, and Dr. Craig just gave voice to this opinion, that when we look at the universe, all we see are patterns of events. Just one thing follows another. Okay, and there's no corner of the universe that declares certain of its events to be good or evil or right or wrong. Apart from us, I mean, our minds, we declare certain events to be better than others. But in doing that, it seems that we're merely projecting our own preferences and desires onto a reality that is intrinsically value-free. Okay, and where do our notions of right and wrong come from? Well, clearly they've been drummed into us by evolution, the product of these apish urges and social emotions. And then they get modulated by culture. Mm-hmm. We take sexual jealousy, for instance. And this is an attitude that has been bred into us over millions of years. Okay, our ancestors were highly covetous of one another, despite the fact that everyone was covered with hair and had terrible teeth. And this possessiveness now gets enshrined in various cultural institutions like the institution of marriage. Okay, so therefore a statement like, it's wrong to cheat on one's spouse, okay, seems a mere summation of these contingencies. It seems like it's an improvisation on the back of biology. It seems that from the point of view of science, it can't really be wrong to cheat on your spouse. Okay, this is just how apes like ourselves worry when we learn to worry with words. Okay, now here is where religious people, like Dr. Craig, begin to get a little queasy, as I think they should. Okay.
I love how he keeps addressing Dr. Craig. This is good. I didn't realize Sam was going to come with this very patient, sobering criticism.
And many see no alternative but to insert the God of Abraham, an Iron Age God of war, into the clockwork as an invisible arbiter of moral truth.
Oh!
Okay, it is wrong to cheat on your spouse because Yahweh deems that it is so. Which is curious because in other moods, Yahweh is perfectly fond of genocide and slavery and human sacrifice.
or taking, other people's wives, giving them 30 days to mourn the death of their last husband, or take the virgins only, annihilate everyone else, or et cetera, et cetera. Like, what?
I must say, it's pretty amusing to hear Dr. Craig in his opening remarks say that I'm merely focused on the flourishing of sentient creatures on this planet. Okay, if that's a sin, I'll take it. Okay, one wonders what Dr. Craig is focused on. Now, incidentally, you should not trust Dr. Craig's reading of me. Half the quotes he provided from me, as though I wrote them, were quotes from people I was quoting in my book, and often to different effects. So you'll have to read the book.
Wow. So Dr. Craig was taking him out of context by... this just goes and proves the point over and over. Craig did this with Carol. Craig's done this with Bob Price. Craig's done this in almost every debate that we've encountered. He cherry picks and quotes stuff out of context or uses it to try and get to the goal and doesn't even understand where the quote actually comes from and the meaning behind these things. That's really, really, really bad.
Now, in claiming that values reduce to the well-being of conscious creatures, as I will, I'm introducing two concepts, consciousness and well-being. Now, let's start with consciousness. This is not an arbitrary starting point. Imagine a universe devoid of the possibility of consciousness. Imagine a universe entirely constituted of rocks. Okay, there's clearly no happiness or suffering in this universe. There's no good or evil. Value judgments don't apply. For changes in the universe to matter, they have to matter at least potentially to some conscious system. Okay, what about well-being? Well, the well-being of conscious creatures and the link between that and morality may seem open to doubt, but it shouldn't. Okay, here's the only assumption you have to make. Imagine a universe in which every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Okay, I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. Okay, if the word bad applies anywhere, it applies here. Now, if you think the worst possible misery for everyone isn't bad, or maybe it has a silver lining, or maybe there's something worse, I don't know what you're talking about. And what's more, I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're talking about either. What I'm saying is the minimum standard of moral goodness is to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. If we should do anything in this universe, if we ought to do anything, if we have a moral duty to do anything, it's to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone. And the moment you admit this, you admit that all other states of the universe are better than the worst possible misery for everyone. You have the worst possible misery for everyone over here, and all these other constellation of experiences arrayed out here. And because the experience of conscious creatures is dependent in some way on the laws of nature, there will be right and wrong ways to move along this continuum. It will be possible to think you're avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone and to fail. You can be wrong in your beliefs about how to navigate this space. So here's my argument for moral truth in the context of science. Questions of right and wrong and good and evil depend upon minds. Okay, they depend upon the possibility of experience. Minds are natural phenomena. They depend upon the laws of nature in some way. Okay, morality and human values, therefore, can be understood through science because in talking about these things, we are talking about all of the facts that influence the well-being of conscious creatures. In our case, we're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics. Now, I view this space of all possible experience as a kind of moral landscape with peaks that correspond to the heights of well-being and valleys that correspond to the lowest suffering. And the first thing to realize is that there may be many equivalent peaks in this space. There may be many different but morally equivalent ways for human beings to thrive, but there will be many more ways not to thrive. There'll be many more ways to fail to be on a peak. There are clearly more ways to suffer unnecessarily in this world than to be sublimely happy. Now, the Taliban are still my favorite example of a culture that is struggling mightily to build a society that's clearly less good than many other societies on offer. The average lifespan for women in Afghanistan is 44 years. Okay, they have a 12% literacy rate. They have the highest, almost the highest infant mortality and maternal mortality in the world, and almost the highest fertility. So this is one of the best places on earth to watch women and infants die. It seems to me perfectly obvious that the best response to this dire situation, which is to say the most moral response, is not to throw battery acid in the faces of little girls for the crime of learning to read. Now, of course, this is common sense to us, unless you happen to be a bioethicist on the President's Commission at this moment. But I'm saying, at bottom, these are also truths about biology and neurology and psychology and sociology and economics. It is not unscientific to say that the Taliban are wrong about morality. That the moment we notice that we know anything at all about human well-being, we have to say this.
So, okay, I had to let him go because he's a deep thinker. So he is anchoring the scientific observations about what seems to give most flourish and overall goodness, well-being to humans at all, is a scientific observation we can observe. We can even improve upon our ethics and morality by observing the behaviors and the functions of society and people. And throwing battery acid, of course, on a little girl because she started reading or she was secretly reading is clearly totally backwards, totally ridiculous, and absolutely morally reprehensible. Whereas helping teach kids who didn't have anyone teaching them how to read, teaching those kids and stopping the battery acid would be a good, right? You would imagine that common sense would factor in on rational beings like ourselves. Maybe primates don't have the thinking capacity to other primates in their brains to think in this way. And maybe we are like primates and eventually our predecessors eventually look back and go, whoa, they were so backwards and we've evolved our ethics to get to that place. It's almost like Craig saying, no, you just got to look back here and you got it all. Right here in this Iron Age deity in these ancient texts, you got it all. Which leaves very little room to ultimately improve at the overall ethical system and adjust those frequencies, so to speak, to the best thriving kind of situation for people on Earth, for humans. And that's I think, a very important point to think about.
Hey, now, some people with a little philosophical training may be tempted to say, but what if a father wants to burn off his daughter's face with battery acid? You know, who are you to say that he's not as moral as we are? What if he has an alternate conception of well-being that's just as legitimate? Or who's to say that we should care about the well-being of little girls? This is the kind of email I get, incidentally. Now, moral skeptics of this kind, and Dr. Craig has essentially endorsed this position in a way without God, think that...
That's the problem too, though. He has endorsed this kind of thing without God, almost championing the idea that you can, and you know, there's no God. You can do whatever you want. It's a stupid idea that I heard, again, as I said earlier, when David Wood says, I might as well murder if Jesus isn't true. It's like this whole worldview is so causing you a delusion to thinking you're doing the right thing because God said so, that if that ends up being a delusion, you now should go and behave in the most ridiculous ways, as if that's not a ridiculous position to do. It's not pragmatic to behave like that. And that's thinking of others as well. So there's so much here to unpack.
The only way to judge one person's values to be wrong are with respect to another person's values, and all such judgments have to be on a par. Okay, this is not true. There are many ways for my values to be objectively wrong. They can be wrong with respect to deeper values that I hold. They can be wrong with respect to deeper values that I would hold if I were only a deeper person. It is clearly possible to value things that will reliably make you miserable in this life. It's clearly possible to be cognitively and emotionally closed to experiences that you would want if you were only intelligent and knowledgeable enough to want them. It is possible not to know what one is missing in life. So things can be right or wrong or good or evil, quite independent of a person's opinions. Now, some of you might worry that I haven't defined well-being enough. How can something this loose as a concept be the benchmark of objective values? Well, consider by analogy the concept of physical health. Physical health is very difficult to define. You know, it used to be that if you were healthy, you could expect to live to the ripe old age of 40. You know, now our lifespan, our life expectancy has doubled in the last 150 years. What does health mean? Okay, well, it has something to do with not always vomiting, okay, not being in excruciating pain, not running a fever. Okay, but how fast should a healthy person be able to run? That question might not have an answer. Okay, but this does not make the question of health vacuous. Okay, it doesn't make it merely a matter of opinion or of cultural construction. Okay, the distinction between a healthy person and a dead one is about as clear and consequential as any we ever make in science. Okay, and notice that no one is ever tempted to attack the philosophical underpinnings of medicine with questions like, well, who are you to say that not always vomiting is healthy? What if you meet someone who wants to vomit and he wants to vomit until he dies? Okay, how could you argue that he is not as healthy as you are? In talking about morality and human values, I think we really are talking about mental health and the health of societies. And the truth is, science has always been in the values business. We simply cannot speak of facts without resorting to values. I mean, consider the simplest statement of scientific fact. Water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. This seems as value-free an utterance as human beings ever make. But what do we do when someone doubts the truth of this proposition? Okay, all we can do is appeal to scientific values, the value of understanding the world, the value of evidence, the value of logical consistency. What if someone says, well, that's not how I choose to think about water. Okay, I'm a biblical chemist and I read in Genesis 1 that God created water before he created light. So I take that to mean that there were no stars. So there were no stars to fuse helium and hydrogen into heavier elements like oxygen. Therefore, there was no oxygen to put in the water. So either water has no oxygen or God created special oxygen to put in the water. But I don't think he would do that because that would be biblically inelegant. Okay, what can we say to such a person? Okay, all we can do is appeal to scientific values. And if he doesn't share those values, the conversation is over. Okay, if someone doesn't value evidence, what evidence are you going to provide to prove that they should value it? If someone doesn't value logic, what logical argument could...
This is why that Kagan guy, the philosopher scholar that debated Craig that we reviewed already, reacted to, he points out that this ethical system is like a contract amongst other rational, intelligent people who have a common interest of an achieved goal. And that, I think, is important because if the other side is not interested in the evidence or they have their conclusions and they're not interested in improving upon the evidence based on what seems to be more likely, then you're going to bump into a wall and you're never going to get past those points. And someone like William Lane Craig, who needs a God to do it, might be one of those people you could just never get past that point with.
You provide to show the importance of logic. Okay, so I think this split between facts and values should look really strange to you on its face. I mean, what are we really saying when we say that science can't be applied to the most important questions in human life? Okay, we're saying that when we get our biases out of the way, when we most fully rely on clear reasoning and honest observation, when intellectual honesty is at its zenith, well, then those efforts have no application whatsoever to the most important questions in human life. That is precisely the mood you cannot be in to answer the most important questions in human life. It would be very strange if that were so.
Okay. So I'd like to see them go back and forth. This is part 1 of our reaction to this debate. It'll be interesting to see what happens when they do their responses. I don't know if they're going head to head, toe to toe. What do you think? I mean, this is an interesting observation. Is Sam wrong on his objective thing? Is he right? What are your thoughts about that? And then what are your thoughts about William Lane Craig and what he's trying to do here? I obviously I've seen this guy pull every parlor trick out of the book. I mean, this guy is definitely a debater, you know. You got to really be careful with when he quotes people and does all that kind of stuff. It's just how he operates. Seriously, I appreciate you for recommending this. I'm glad to watch this. Never seen this one. We'll pick up the second part, of course, in the next video you'll see. And be sure to subscribe so you get notified. Check that bell. If you don't do it, they won't notify you. Thanks for being part of my community. Like, this is a really awesome community of people who are enjoying these reactions with me. You know, you take your cap off. You don't have to overthink some of this, because my big channel is all about like deep thinking and scholarly stuff. This is like in that vein, but you can kind of chill and relax and enjoy and just comment what you think about stuff. So thanks for being here. Comment below so YouTube sees that interaction and they promote this video. By having you comment, it means the world to me. Like it, share it if you have any socials, and again, you can join our Patreon. Link is in the description if you want to personally message me, or if you're interested in seeing some of the early releases I have on a lot of material I do on my big channel, do so. But until next time, see you then.